The sun burned overhead in 1883 as the small town of Dry Hollow, New Mexico, baked under the relentless summer heat. The town square, typically bustling with life and chatter, was now a place of tension and judgment. The townsfolk had gathered like flies to a carcass, their eyes fixed on one person, Nora May. Bound to a wooden post, her arms raised above her head, Nora stood alone, exposed to the unforgiving gaze of the crowd. Her crime? An accusation of tempting a married man, a claim no one had bothered to question. The accusations had been swift, cruel, and final. A woman's word had been enough to condemn her. As Nora stood there, her body bruised, bloodied, and broken, the crowd threw rotten tomatoes, overripe fruit, and stale bread at her. The insult stung worse than the objects that hit her. Her once pale blue dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing deep bruises. Her lip was split, one eye swollen, and her bare feet bled from walking on the gravel beneath her. The women of the town clucked their tongues and shook their heads, their judgment wrapped in the false righteousness of their whispers. The men leaned against their porches, arms crossed, chewing tobacco as though this were just another Sunday. There was no sympathy, there was no second chance, only the cruel punishment for a woman who dared to exist outside the narrow expectations of Dry Hollow's moral code. A voice broke through the air, sharp and venomous. "That's what you get for tempting married men, little harlot." The crowd erupted in laughter as another voice joined in, adding fuel to the fire. The mayor's son said she cornered him behind the chapel, begged for it. Another rotten tomato hit Nora in the side, and she flinched. Her breath caught in her throat. The world around her seemed to blur and shrink, the crowd's faces melting into indistinguishable figures. She opened her swollen eyes, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. "Please let me go," she gasped, her voice cracking. She wasn't begging for mercy, she was begging for the dignity she had lost in this small town. But no one moved, no one cared. Not a single soul in that crowd wondered if she had been forced. They saw only the bruises, the blood, and the story they had decided to believe. Then something shifted in the air, something that made the crowd pause and fall silent. Heavy bootsteps, purposeful, steady. The crowd parted like the Red Sea without knowing why. Through the dust, a man emerged, tall and broad-shouldered. His hat was dark, and the brim cast a shadow over his face. He wore no badge, and there were no greetings exchanged, yet his presence commanded respect. It was as though the world around him bent, just for a moment, to allow him to walk through. Nora's eyes, blurred with tears and pain, locked onto the man as he approached her. She didn't know him, but there was something about him, a steadiness, a quiet power. His eyes met hers, the color of storm clouds, but there was no judgment in them. There was recognition. Without a word, he turned to the sheriff, who had been watching from the side, arms folded like an executioner. "Untie her," the man said, his voice low but sharp, like the command of a man who had seen too much and feared nothing. The sheriff blinked in surprise. "Excuse me." The man didn't wait. He moved toward the post with calm determination, his hand reaching for the knife at his side. Without threatening, without raising his voice, he slashed through the ropes that bound Nora. The ropes fell to the ground with a soft thud, and for the first time in hours, Nora was free. She stumbled forward, her body too weak to hold itself upright, but strong arms caught her, lifting her into a safety she had never known. The crowd stood in stunned silence, murmurs rising in low whispers. Someone in the crowd recognized the man. "That's Charles Boone," they whispered. "He disappeared after that shootout years ago. Never thought he'd show his face again." Charles Boone stood before Nora, his gaze steady and unwavering. As he looked at her, he didn't see a woman stained by sin. He saw someone worth saving, and for the first time in her life, Someone had stepped forward not to pity her, but to offer her the one thing she had never been given: freedom. The town's wrath and a silent hero. As Nora swayed in Charles's arms, the town square seemed to hold its breath. The silence was thick with disbelief, and the whispers of the crowd began to grow louder. Charles Boone, no badge, no title, just a man with a past, had walked into the town and done what no one else had dared. He had cut her loose, but it wasn't just the rope that had been severed. It was the very fabric of the town's unspoken rules. The crowd, once so eager to see her punished, now found themselves questioning their own actions. They had expected Charles to fall in line, to back down in the face of their collective judgment. But he didn't. He stood tall and unyielding, a figure who commanded respect without ever raising his voice. The sheriff sputtered, his face red with indignation. "She's been sentenced by the town council," he said, his words trying to regain control of the situation. Charles didn't even flinch. He turned to face the sheriff and the crowd, his voice low but full of truth. "If you're going to punish her for being alone in this world, then let me stand beside her." His words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The weight of his quiet defiance was enough to silence the crowd. In that moment, the crowd's condemnation began to crumble. The whispers grew uncertain, unsure of their stance. Charles didn't wait for their approval. He didn't need it. He had already made his decision. As Charles held Nora, guiding her out of the square, the townsfolk stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do next. For the first time in a long while, Nora felt something unfamiliar, a sense of safety. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't the woman tied to the post, humiliated for all to see. She was a person deserving of dignity, and someone who wasn't afraid, had finally stood up for her. The ride to freedom, escape, and solitude. Charles Boone and Nora May left Dry Hollow behind, the town slowly shrinking in the rear view as they journeyed into the vast, golden expanse of the prairie. The wheels of the wagon creaked rhythmically on the dusty road, their steady motion the only sound in the vast silence between them. Nora sat stiffly beside Charles, her mind still reeling from the events of the day. She didn't know where they were going, nor did she care. The only thing that mattered now was the escape, the feeling of being free from the suffocating judgments that had nearly destroyed her. Charles didn't speak as they rode. He didn't push her to share her thoughts or feelings. There was no rush to fill the space with words. In the calm, Nora felt something strange. Peace. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was steady. She could breathe, something she hadn't realized she'd been deprived of for so long. The sun began to set as they passed through wide stretches of empty land, golden light casting long shadows across the hills. They traveled in silence, the wind whispering through the dry grass. Nora could feel the weight of her past, her shame, her guilt, the years of rejection, begin to slip away, like the dust blowing behind them. After hours of traveling, Charles finally slowed the wagon as a small cabin came into view. Nestled between rolling hills, surrounded by nothing but open space, it seemed as though the cabin had sprung from the earth itself, quiet and solid. It wasn't much. Wooden walls weathered by time, a roof that had seen better days. But for Nora, it was a world apart from the town square she'd been bound in just hours ago. A place where no one knew her name, where no one would judge her. Charles guided the horses to a stop and climbed down first. Without a word, he reached a hand out to Nora, but she hesitated for a moment before accepting it. As she slid down from the wagon, her knees wobbled beneath her, weak from the ordeal. But Charles was there, steadying her with a firm, quiet hand. "Come on inside," he said, his voice low but warm. "You're safe here." For the first time in what felt like forever, Nora didn't feel the weight of eyes upon her. She didn't have to pretend to be someone she wasn't. She didn't have to shield herself from the harshness of a world that had already judged her. Here, there was space for her to simply exist. It was the kind of peace she had never known. The safe haven, healing without words. Inside the cabin, the air was still and smelled faintly of pine, a welcoming scent that seemed to wrap around Nora like a blanket. The fire crackled softly in the stove, its warmth making the cool night air feel comfortable. There was nothing grand about the place, just simple furnishings, a wooden chair by the stove, a table set with a single plate and mug, but it was enough. The kind of enough Nora had been starved for her entire life. Charles didn't rush her. He didn't expect anything from her. He offered her space, space to think, space to breathe, space to just be. Nora stood at the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to do with this unexpected kindness. She had been so accustomed to being used, to being seen as something to be fixed or judged, that the simple act of being treated like a person felt foreign. Charles didn't press her. He didn't ask her questions or push her to talk about what had happened in Dry Hollow. Instead, he moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, lighting a lamp, setting the table, and preparing a small meal. Everything he did was deliberate, done with the calm assurance of a man who was used to solitude, who had learned the value of peace in a world full of noise. Nora watched him for a while, unsure of how to fit into this new life. But Charles didn't look at her like she was fragile, broken, or in need of fixing. He looked at her like she was, like she was just a person, like she mattered. For the first time, Nora felt human again, not the object of pity or scorn, but someone worthy of respect. She sat at the table as Charles placed a bowl of stew in front of her. "Eat. You need it," he said, his voice steady but soft. Nora didn't respond, but she took the spoon in her hand. As she ate, she realized something. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being watched. No one was waiting for her to fail. No one was waiting for her to crumble. Charles wasn't here to save her. He was here because he believed she had the right to live. A new beginning, the quiet rhythm of life days in the cabin passed slowly, without the urgency of the outside world. Charles didn't push Nora to speak, nor did he force her to do anything. He simply let her find her rhythm. And in that rhythm, Nora began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. She found herself in the small tasks, the tending of the garden, the care of the animals. Charles showed her how to tend to the herbs he grew, comfrey, lavender, mint. It wasn't complicated, but there was something therapeutic about it. The simplicity of it grounded her, helped her focus not on her past, but on the present. Charles's care for the animals was gentle, respectful, something Nora had never seen in a man before. He treated the animals as if they were family, not just tools or things to be used. There was no harshness in his actions, no impatience. He didn't force her to do anything. Instead, he worked beside her, showing her how to care for the small garden and teaching her how to pick herbs without damaging them. He didn't rush her, didn't make her feel like she was slow or inefficient. For the first time, Nora realized what it felt like to do something without being criticized or watched closely. Charles didn't see her as a broken woman in need of saving. He simply saw her as someone who had been hurt, someone who needed space to breathe. He didn't offer grand promises, didn't try to fix her. He gave her something more powerful. He gave her the freedom to heal on her own terms, and that made all the difference. The storm, breaking free from the past. One night, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind howled as rain began to pour down in sheets, rattling against the wooden walls of the cabin. Nora stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the fury of the storm outside. The storm mirrored something inside her, the fear, the uncertainty, the chaos that had once ruled her life. But Charles didn't try to comfort her with words. He didn't need to. Instead, he stood beside her, quietly offering her the gift of his presence. He didn't rush her, didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply stood there, a steady, unshakable force. And in that moment, Nora realized something. She was safe. The storm outside couldn't touch her. The past couldn't touch her. She wasn't bound by the ropes of judgment anymore. When the storm passed, Nora finally allowed herself to feel the relief she had been too afraid to experience. The past didn't have power over her anymore. The weight of the town's judgment, the whispers, the cruelty, it was all gone. It no longer had the power to hurt her. In its place was a stillness, a peace that came from simply being seen, being understood, and being free. The visitor confronting the past. Just as Nora began to find peace, the past had a way of catching up with her. A few days after the storm, a knock came at the door. Charles stood up, his body tense but calm as ever. He opened the door to find the sheriff and a small group of outraged townsfolk standing on the porch. The weight of their disapproval hung heavy in the air like a storm about to break. "We've come for her," the sheriff said, his voice sharp and cold. "You can't keep her here, Boone." Charles didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his gun, didn't shout. He simply walked out to meet them, his steps slow but firm. The sheriff's voice grew louder, but Charles didn't respond. Instead, he stood there, unwavering. There was no fear in his eyes. There was no apology in his stance. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. "Leave her be," Charles said, his voice low but firm. "She's not going anywhere." The townsfolk muttered among themselves, but Charles didn't back down. He had already made his stand. For the first time, Nora saw the strength of a man who would not let fear dictate his actions. The stand, choosing family over fear. The air outside had grown thick with the tension of confrontation. As Charles stood there facing the sheriff and the group of outraged townsfolk, there was no sign of fear, no flicker of doubt in his eyes. The crowd, full of righteous anger, expected him to back down, to submit to their demands as they had done with so many others in the past. But Charles wasn't like the others. With the weight of the situation heavy between them, the sheriff stepped forward, his voice full of authority. "You can't just hide her away out here, Boone. We have the law on our side." Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back toward the cabin where Nora stood, watching from the doorway. His eyes softened, and a sense of calm washed over him. For Nora, standing there, the sight of Charles facing the crowd was everything she had been looking for her whole life. Someone who wouldn't run, who wouldn't hide, who wouldn't let the world decide her fate. Charles turned back to face the sheriff, his voice steady but filled with a quiet strength. "If you want peace, leave her be. If you want war, you'll find that I'm not afraid." The sheriff hesitated. The people behind him shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Charles and the others. They weren't expecting defiance. They weren't expecting him to stand his ground like this. But Charles wasn't backing down, and the weight of that unflinching resolve made the air around them seem to thicken. Then one of the younger men, eager to prove himself, took a step forward. He reached for his belt, perhaps to draw a weapon, or maybe to make a show of force. Charles didn't give him the chance. With a fluid motion, Charles drew his revolver, not in a threatening way, but with an assurance that sent a clear message. He was not afraid. He raised the gun, aimed it straight into the sky, and fired a single shot. The deafening crack of the bullet splitting the air sent birds scattering into the sky, and the crowd froze. There was no more laughter, no more anger, only the echo of the gunshot reverberating across the plains. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The sheriff stood there, his face pale, realizing that the threat of violence had been made real, and Charles, as calm and steady as ever, spoke again, his voice firm and unyielding. This land belongs to me, and she belongs with me. The sheriff's eyes darted to the crowd, but no one stepped forward to challenge Charles. The town, in that instant, had been silenced. The people who had been so quick to judge Nora now found themselves questioning everything they had once believed. The power dynamic had shifted. The land, the cabin, and the woman who had once been tied to the post were no longer in their control. Charles had chosen his side, and for Nora, it was the first time she realized that she had someone who would stand by her no matter the cost. For the first time, she wasn't alone. Without another word, the crowd began to disperse, muttering and grumbling under their breath. But Charles didn't move. He stood tall, facing them until they were gone, his presence commanding respect. As the last of the townsfolk disappeared, Nora stepped out from the cabin, her heart still pounding from the tension. She walked slowly toward Charles, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to do that." Charles looked down at her, his gaze steady. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for the both of us. We're not going to let them dictate who we are." And for the first time since that fateful day in Dry Hollow, Nora felt the kind of freedom that came not from escaping the past, but from facing it head-on and standing tall. For the first time, she realized that redemption wasn't about being saved. It was about choosing to save yourself and having someone beside you who would help you get there. The decision, embracing love without conditions. As the days passed, the quiet rhythm of life continued in the cabin. The threat from the town had faded, but the peace that followed was a quiet kind of healing. Nora and Charles had settled into a simple routine. Each morning, Charles would saddle his horse and offer to take Nora with him. At first, she had declined, but over time, the thought of being out on the land with him, surrounded by nothing but wide open spaces, became too tempting to resist. One morning, Charles returned from checking the fence line, his hands covered in dirt, his face more weathered from the sun than usual. He didn't speak at first. He just let Nora be. But as they sat together in the small cabin, something shifted in the air between them. Charles reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. He unwrapped it slowly and revealed a handmade ring. It wasn't like the rings she had heard of in stories. No polished gold, no sparkling jewels. This was something more raw, more real. The band was made of bent steel, smooth and polished by hand, with a small inlay of dark mahogany wood. Nora's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the ring. There were no grand gestures, no speeches, just the quiet promise of something she had never thought possible. For the first time in her life, someone was offering her something without expecting anything in return. "I never asked," Charles said quietly, his voice steady but vulnerable, "because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. But I ask now, freely." He paused, holding her gaze. "Will you be my wife?" For a moment, Nora didn't know how to respond. She had spent so much of her life hiding from the truth, burying the parts of herself that felt unworthy of love. But standing there, in the quiet of the cabin, she realized something that made her heart swell with emotion. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to be fixed. She was enough, just as she was. With tears in her eyes, she nodded, her voice shaky but filled with truth. "Yes," she whispered, "I will." Charles didn't say anything more. He simply took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It wasn't a perfect fit. There was a slight gap, but it didn't matter. It was honest, just like everything else about their lives together. In that moment, Nora knew that love wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about perfection. It was about finding someone who saw you, not for the mistakes, not for the shame, but for who you truly were. And for the first time in her life, Nora felt truly seen. Conclusion: the legacy of love. The day of their wedding was simple. No grand ceremony, no flowers or elaborate dresses, just the wide open sky, the quiet hum of the prairie wind, and a love that had been forged through fire and silence. The day felt like everything and nothing at once, a moment suspended in time. Nora stood barefoot in the grass, wearing a simple linen dress, her hair braided loosely. Charles, standing across from her, wore a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his boots dusty from the day's work. There was no preacher, no official ceremony. There was only the promise between them, the quiet vows spoken with no need for perfection. "I can't promise you a perfect life," Charles said, his voice steady and sincere, "but I promise you won't face it alone." Nora smiled, her heart full. "That's all I need." They didn't exchange rings again. There were no vows beyond that simple promise. They were two people who had been broken and mended, who had found each other in a world full of chaos and judgment. And now, together, they were beginning a new life. As the sun set over Dry Hollow, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, Charles and Nora walked together into the future, not as a cowboy and a woman saved, but as equals, bound by a love that had been earned and chosen. Their legacy was not one of perfection, but of truth, trust, and the quiet strength of standing by each other no matter what. And for Nora, that was enough. The town of Dry Hollow still whispered. Of course, it always would, but Nora didn't care anymore. She had found something more powerful than the voices of the past. She had found herself. And that was a legacy worth living for.